Welcome back to Proxamer, everybody, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about how to fight against Nurgle as the Craftworld Eldar. So as many of you may know, having experience with Death Guard or Nurgle demons or anything like that, Nurgle Plague Marines and Plague Bearers and so forth, all those Nurgle units are extremely tough by the standards of the other units in their codex. And to be honest with you, pretty much by the standard of any unit in 40k. They're one of the toughest armies in the game, surpassing that of even Necrons in some cases. And they have a lot of abilities that quite honestly negate some of our most potent weapons against Marine equivalent armies. Things like shuriken cannons and stuff like that are almost completely useless point for point against things like Death Guard and Blight Lord Terminators. Shuriken cannons just don't have the hitting power, nor do weapons with even damage 3. So the question becomes, well, if my best anti-mech tools are not effective against these guys, then what kind of tools do I have to deal with them? And what kind of strategies can I employ to get around their extremely good objective game, which is one of the best in the entire game? Death Guard are extremely good at just holding objectives and just staying there and being sickeningly tough and resilient. So that's what we're basically going to be talking about in this video, because Eldar actually do have a few workarounds that you might not expect to dealing with these types of really tough units that negate weapon damage and so forth. So let's get right into it. So in this video, we're going to be looking at why Nurgle units are so tough to deal with as Craftworld Eldar. We're going to be going over that. We're going to be looking at the top Nurgle units and their strengths and weaknesses. These are the most common Nurgle units that you'll see in pretty much every army. Obviously, I didn't want to make this video 3 or 4 hours long, so I didn't include all of the Nurgle units, but we're going to be talking about the most often encountered. And we're also going to be talking a little bit about how to play against Nurgle, as well as the different Craftworld Eldar units that are effective at killing those Nurgle units. So why exactly are Nurgle units so tough to deal with as Craftworld Eldar? So, we have a very specialized list of units that hit really hard against certain targets and are very specialized. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's a little bit difficult to pin these down and to actually kill Nurgle units effectively, because we go in with the mindset that we need to choose a unit and have a unit for every specific situation that is pretty much going to be an exact counter. And what we have to do instead of thinking that way is, when we're going against things like Plague Marines and Plague Bearers, we have to think about other weapons that might be effective against those units, accounting for their high toughness. We can't just put them in the same category as other Space Marines or other infantry units with invul saves. We can't do that because they're a little bit tougher. Actually, a lot tougher, to be honest. So we can't just assume that shuriken cannons are going to be effective against Plague Marines in the same way that they're effective against regular Primaris Marines or Tactical Marines. We can't think that way. We have to think of other solutions and other weapons that might be effective. And luckily, we have this in spades, and many of you might not even see it. But essentially, the 3 main reasons why Nurgle is so tough as well for Eldar to deal with is that they have extremely high toughness across the board, which makes a lot of our anti-infantry weapons less effective. They have damage reduction abilities like Feel No Pain, which is essentially something you can't even get around. It's a save after a save. If anyone ever played Warhammer Fantasy back in the day, it's kind of like a ward save, which is something you always get. And it's pretty much always a 5+, and they get -1 damage to a lot of their units, which makes it extremely hard for things like shuriken cannons and stuff like that to get through. And they have fantastic, and when I say fantastic, I mean almost the best in the game, objective play in holding objectives. And they have a lot of objective secured units. Things like Plague Bearers and Plague Marines are all objective secured and are very good units. You're going to be fighting a lot of these when you go against a Death Guard army. And they have very tough infantry that's hard to move off of those objectives once they're there. And some of these top Nurgle units include Plague Marines, which I'm sure everybody who's had trouble with Death Guard has seen at least 4 or 5 units of these on the field, if not more. To be honest, my friend who runs Death Guard, he runs 6 full units in his list of 5, and they're very tough to move off of objectives, and they play the objective game extremely well. Plague Bearers, which are just kind of like a hordish infantry, but very tough as well for their cost. And Blight Lord Terminators, which are essentially just a souped up version of a Plague Marine with extra combat ability, extra shooting ability, and extra toughness. Now, the Plague Bearers I mentioned are in the Chaos Demons Codex. I'm not going to go too much into Chaos Demons themselves. The reason why is because when the new Chaos Demons Codex comes out, I do plan on reviewing it and going over all of the different types of units that will be effective against those. But for right now, I'm going to just talk about the Plague Bearers in their current state. And I actually think Plague Bearers are a little bit less of a problem than Plague Marines and Blight Lord Terminators. So I will be going into them a little bit, but a little bit less and a little bit less into the Chaos Demons Codex in general, because they're coming out with a new book soon, and that information is soon going to be irrelevant. So starting off with the Plague Marines, they are extremely tough. They're about 21 points a model. They're toughness 5, 2 wounds. They have Armor of Contempt and -1 damage against all attacks. They get double shots of standing still at maximum range, and this is great for defending objectives because it means they can still do damage while basically just sitting there, doing nothing. They have an aura that reduces enemy toughness when within a certain range, which makes it really difficult to win prolonged fights against them, which means that if you are going to fight them in combat, it better be quick because they will grind you down otherwise. They get to reroll 1s to wound with their plague weapons, which again makes them even a little bit more potent in combat. They have upgrades that make them just in general better at attrition and grindy fights. So again, if you plan on throwing a unit in there like Wraithguard who just want to grind down, they're going to be very cost effective against those types of enemies. However, they also have movement 5 and are very slow, ponderously so. And once they get to an objective, yes, they stay there, but it might take them a while to get set up on those objectives in the first place. And this is where Craftworld Eldar really has the most advantages against Nurgle. Because they're so slow and they don't really have a lot of ways to move, there's a lot of things that we can do to either block them from getting to certain things first or completely circumvent their positions and go elsewhere on the board. Remember, Nurgle are tough, but they can't be everywhere at once. Usually, Nurgle will stick to a certain area of the board and hold that area very well, score a lot of points on it, do their actions and stuff like that, but they're not going to be able to control the whole board normally. Even at 2,000 points, this is going to be a hard thing for Nurgle to do without actually losing one of their flanks if they spread their forces too thin. So, what are the Craftworld Eldar counters to Plague Marines? Because for all the strategy, we do need ways of killing them, right? We can't just leave them alive the entire game. So, I think the biggest counters to Plague Marines might surprise you. The first one is Warlocks with Singing Spears. Second is Striking Scorpions. Then Swooping Hawks and Warp Spiders are also very effective. And D-Cannons, D-Sights, and all other mortal wound damage is also absolutely effective against these guys as well. So some of these choices might surprise you a little bit, right? Striking Scorpions typically aren't designed to go against high armor, high toughness units, but they actually do very well against these types of targets, especially since they do mortal wound damage to infantry. Swooping Hawks and Warp Spiders are normally considered a light infantry killer, but because of their massive amount of attacks, they can get around things like the -1 damage and stuff like that. And they also have decently good ability to wound. Swooping Hawks auto wound on 6s to hit, and Warp Spiders have a high base strength on their weapons. D-Sights are something that not all of us run because Wraithguard with D-Sights are probably one of the worst choices for Wraithguard. But if you do have them, they are actually very effective against Plague Marines. Extremely so. A unit of these guys will wipe a squad of Plague Marines off the face of the earth in one shot. because they wound on 2s, they do mortal wound damage in addition to normal damage, and even though they only have damage 1 on their weapons, it doesn't really matter too much because they have such a high volume of attacks with really high AP that a lot of wounds will get through and those Plague Marines will be devastated. So some of you might be wondering, well, Proxy Hammer, why are you saying Warlocks with Singing Spears? That doesn't really make sense. They don't have any ability to get through armor. And that's true, but here's the thing. Warlocks with Singing Spears are about 25 points, which if you add up a unit of 5 Warlocks with a unit of 5 Plague Marines with special weapons and upgrades and stuff, they're going to be about the same cost. And for the same cost, Warlocks always wound on a 2+, regardless of enemy toughness. So not only are these guys good against Plague Marines, but they're also going to be able to contribute against other high toughness monsters and, different things in the Nurgle codex. Or codexes, I should say, whether it be demons or whether it be Death Guard. And the Singing Spears actually have damage 3, and they can be thrown as well as a ranged weapon. And this is really effective for dealing with regular Plague Marines because they have -1 damage. So, this means that Singing Spears will still kill a Plague Marine if they fail a wound with damage 2. Damage 3 goes down to damage 2. That means you're still going to be able to kill that Plague Marine. And on top of this, they can cast debuffs and buffs to make these Plague Marines easier to kill at range during combat. Things like Jinx, Empower, Reveal can make Nurgle Marines a little bit easier for the rest of your army to take out. And on top of this, a unit of 5 Warlocks can also cast Smite fairly effectively. And I believe you can actually cast Smite twice because you can cast 2 psychic powers, and Smite is one of the only, I think it is the only psychic power. Correct me if I'm wrong if you know another one, but is the only psychic power that can be cast multiple times in the same psychic phase. So because they can cast 2 powers, they can actually cast this twice, meaning that they can actually take out 2 Plague Marines just with Smite. And if you're lucky, you might be able to take out more. It just depends. So I think Warlocks trade very well into Plague Marines, and they're also very useful against a lot of other stuff in Nurgle armies because they deal mortal wounds, and they're not that high of a cost. 25 points for what you get with this is about the same as a Plague Marine when you add up all the points together. Plague Marines are 21, these guys are 25, but when you account for the weapon upgrades and stuff like that, they're about equal. Striking Scorpions are also very good against things like Plague Marines because they have a high volume of attacks and they have strength 5. So they normally wound on a 2+. They also have Mandiblasters, which deal mortal wounds to get around armor and toughness because it is in addition to normal damage. And their Sustained Assault ability gives them even more attacks, and the Exarch auto wounds with crushing blows. So a unit of these guys can also very easily, with a few debuffs, take out a unit of Plague Marines. Pretty easily, actually. And to be honest with you, I think that they can also deal very good damage against Nurgle characters too, because they have the ability to deal mortal wounds. They can get around a lot of the characters' invuls and stuff like that. Now, I'm not saying they can take on I think his name's Mortarion. I think that's how you pronounce it, but basically the Primarch of the Nurgle. No, I don't think they can take out him, but they can take out a lot of other characters, regular Terminator Lords, for example, and stuff like that. They can pretty much effectively take out in one turn of combat. So Striking Scorpions are also another big tool that you can use to strike from the shadows, take out a squad of Plague Marines, and trade up. Because again, Plague Marines are more expensive than these guys by a lot. So, by about 3 points a model, which actually is quite a bit more. So, Striking Scorpions, another good counter to Nurgle units. And of course, we have Swooping Hawks and Warp Spiders, not for their ability to deal with enemy armor, but for their large volume of fire and good strength on their weapons or the ability to auto-wound. Swooping Hawks auto-wound and Warp Spiders have strength 6 on their weapons, so they can kind of get around that high toughness of the Plague Marines. And both units can hit the enemy pretty hard, especially with debuffs and the right combination of buffs, and then fade back to safety to do the same thing the next turn. So next up, we have D-Cannons, D-Sights, and all other forms of mortal wound damage, which are extremely effective against Plague units. The mortal wound damage and high strength of D weapons means that a lot of the strengths of Plague Marines are reduced considerably. Their high toughness, their -1 to damage and stuff like that are going to be a lot less effective against all forms of D weaponry. Also, Farseers and Warlocks are another great source of mortal wound damage with offensive psychic powers as well. I know that in certain Hail of Doom lists, there is a combination with the Bow of Kurnus, which can be very effective at killing Plague Marines, and can probably, with the right setup, can kill an entire squad by himself. So if you do run Hail of Doom, I would suggest looking into that because it's a fairly effective strategy. I personally don't use it, but that's because outside of Hail of Doom lists, it's not really that effective. But if you do have a Hail of Doom list, look into that. I know certain channels, for example, Craftworld Eldar has a video on the Kurnus Bow Hail of Doom trick, basically, or combination, I should say. So if you are interested in that, look into that. But otherwise, just forms of mortal wound damage, Farseers and Warlocks using Smite, Executioner, things like that are also pretty effective against Plague Marines. Then we have Plague Bearers. Now, I actually think Plague Bearers are a lot easier to deal with than Plague Marines because they have no range capacity. But they're pretty tough for their cost. They come with a 5+ invulnerable save and a 5+ feel no pain. So on average, they're going to save about 55% of the time, which essentially gives them a little bit better than a 4+. They come in minimum units of 10 and are very slow at movement 5. However, they do have a chance when taking morale tests to revive D6 models and are at -1 to hit when at 20 models or over. So this could change with the upcoming Demon Codex, but for now, Plague Bearers are incentivized to be taken in large units, and they have the chance to not lose any models to morale tests and things like that, but instead gain models. So what you want to do against these guys is once you start shooting them, you want to make sure that they die. You want to kill them to the very last demon if possible. Now, luckily, we have a lot of counters against Plague Bearers, as Plague Bearers aren't the most tactically sound unit in the way that you can use them for demon armies. They don't have any range attacks. They're very slow and ponderous. They are tough and they're good for holding things down, but that's about it. And if they can get into combat, they can do some decent damage. So anything with a high volume of attacks and range are going to be extremely good against these guys. Screening units like Rangers, Wave Serpents, or Vipers can be extremely good. Blast weapons are also very effective at these guys. Because they're taken in large units, blast weapons will be more effective. And slowing abilities like Restrain, Spider's Lair, and Wire Weave Grenades can make their movement 5 seem even slower than it is, making them essentially a unit that's going to take the whole game to get across the board. So again, Swooping Hawks and Warp Spiders, especially Warp Spiders because they also have the blast keyword, can hit large units of models like this very hard and then fade back to safety. Especially Plague Bearers have no chance of really hitting back. So Swooping Hawks and Warp Spiders, it's basically just a shooting gallery with them. Striking Scorpions can definitely kill a lot of them, but beware. It is better to use them as a finisher because Plague Bearers hit back pretty hard in close combat. So if any Plague Bearers are left alive to strike back against the Striking Scorpions, you could be losing value on that unit. And lastly, I just threw this one in there because Shroud Runners have seen a relative improvement because of the nerf to Wind Riders with Scatter Lasers, and they're pretty excellent as well at killing infantry, even with Feel No Pain and an Invul save. Scatter Lasers, 5 Scatter Lasers can do a lot of damage, especially when you pair that with the fact that they can also shoot sniper rifles and at a generally higher ballistic skill. And as a plus, Shroud Runners also have the Wire Weave Grenade stratagem to slow down enemy units as well. Screening units like Rangers, Wave Serpents, and Vipers are also very effective because you can use these to block charge and movement lanes so that the large unit, usually of 30 Plague Bearers, cannot get to better targets. It's going to have to assault a Viper or a Wave Serpent before it gets through to them. And this can cause even worse trouble because if you get lucky and the Viper explodes, that causes even more damage. So honestly, if you ever find yourself needing to buy a turn against Plague Bearers, and they're on you and there's a lot of them and you can't deal with them in one turn, a good way to deal with it is to screen them out with things like Wave Serpents, Rangers, or Vipers. And also, blast weapons are just very effective against them. Plague Bearers, again, are usually taken in units of larger than 10. So blast weapons are much more effective against them. They do get that bonus when over 20 models of being at -1 to hit, which makes them even more durable, but blast weapons just take this apart. Warp Spiders, Shadow Weavers, even Eldari missile launchers just do massive amounts of damage to them, so much so that they're about 50% save is honestly just not going to be that effective overall. And lastly, we have slowing abilities like Restrain, Spider's Lair, and Wire Weave Grenades. Also, Wire Weave Nets from the Rangers aren't bad. And basically, Plague Bearers already move so slow that subtracting half of their movement, or D3, can make the unit even more of a hindrance, especially if they're blocking other demon units. Think about it. Typically, Nurgle units are very large and they take up a lot of board space. This could actually block other units from getting to where they want to go if you are able to slow these guys down. A good restraint on this unit in the beginning of the game can slow down a greater demon that doesn't have the fly special roll or anything like that, and make it extremely hard for your opponent to maneuver in certain situations. Now, I'm not saying it's going to happen all the time. Sometimes they're just going to line them up side by side, or sometimes the greater demons will be hidden behind terrain for the first couple turns anyway while the Plague Bearers advance. But again, it could be a hindrance. Later in the game too, if your opponent is using Plague Bearers to screen out his more vulnerable targets. And lastly, we have Blight Lord Terminators, the ultimate of Plague, the ultimate of Nurgle. So why are these guys so good? So basically, think of a normal Terminator and how tough they are, multiply that by 2, and then give them better ranged capacities and better combat abilities. That's essentially what Blight Lord Terminators are. They're extremely tough. They're one of the most deadly units in the game as far as having not only really good killing power, but also being very tough. They're extremely tough. They have a 2+ save, 3 wounds, as well as 5 toughness. Their combat weapons can dish out massive damage at range and in combat. They are pretty nasty as well. They have pretty good weapons in close combat. They can do some good damage. And on top of all that, they still have -1 to damage and a 4+ invulnerable save. They are extremely tough to deal with. And by the way, because they're Terminators, unlike normal Plague Marines, they can actually move and fire their combi bolters, having 4 shots apiece at any distance. So it doesn't matter if they move or not. They can always shoot their combi bolters at double shots. So a combi bolter normally has 2 shots, so they will always get 4 shots from combi bolters. And all of their other combi weapons as well will also get double shots. That means double plasma shots, double melta shots, double flamers as well. So these guys are very potent at both shooting and combat. Now, the Craftworld Eldar counters the Blighted Terminators are a little bit harder to gauge than the counters against Plague Marines. But luckily, you'll probably only be having to deal with a couple units of these guys because they are decently expensive with the upgrades. So one small arms fire is extremely effective against these guys, especially in combination with certain things like psychic debuffs of Jinx and Doom, etc. And also Striking Scorpions can be very effective against them as well. However, a little bit of a word of warning. Even though Striking Scorpions can trade upwards into Terminators for their points, they are not good at receiving hits. So that means if your opponent has some command points left over and chooses to use the one where he strikes first, and that's part of the stratagems in the core rulebook, your Striking Scorpions will die and you'll have nothing to show for it. So if you are using Striking Scorpions, it's a good idea to pair this with a Banshee Mask, Howling Banshees, or maybe an Autarch with a Banshee Mask to follow up, because if you don't do this and your opponent has some command points left over, he can just kill your Striking Scorpion unit before they even have the chance to strike, and that's 100+ points down for nothing. So be careful about that. If you do charge any unit of Striking Scorpions, make sure that either your opponent doesn't have the 2 command points for the stratagem, or you have a Banshee Mask that's charging in with them. So the reason I say small arms fire with damage 1 is effective against these guys, because if you use anything with damage 2 or damage 3, you're going to be getting much less effectiveness out of it. So the idea of this is to force your opponent to take a lot of 2+ saves or 3+ saves with Jinx. Units like Swooping Hawks, Warp Spiders, Wind Riders, and Dire Avengers are very good at just forcing your opponent to take a lot of armor saves, to the point where they are going to fail some. And even with things like Armor of Contempt, a full unit of Dire Avengers with the Shredding Fire ability can negate most of the armor of these guys and give you a pretty decent chance at killing a lot of these guys, because they're only going to get a 4+ save against you. And because they only you only have damage 1 anyway, they're not going to be able to reduce any damage that your weapons are doing. So units like Swooping Hawks, Warp Spiders, Dire Avengers, things like that only do 1 damage are very cost effective and can make up a lot of their points in 1 turn with the right debuffs. And of course, when I say debuffs, I am meaning Jinx and Doom. And this makes it much easier for small arms fire to hit hard and generate a lot of wounds. Jinx negates 1 armor from the enemy unit, so Armor of Contempt really doesn't work against this. Armor of Contempt is only for AP on weapons, not for actual armor. So you're negating 1 armor, and Doom itself is going to be able to allow you to reroll all your wounds. So all those strength 4 weapons that are wounding on 5s, you get to reroll. And of course, Striking Scorpions or anything with high mortal wound damage is also going to be very effective against these guys. Striking Scorpions have reasonably high strength with strength 5, and they can be buffed with the Empower ability to get strength 6 and do mortal wound damage on top of just having a lot of attacks. Farseers and Warlocks can also contribute with Smite or Executioner to kill a couple of models. And lastly, of course, D weapons absolutely murder these guys, as expected, as each wound they deal will kill a Terminator. So D cannons are really good against these guys. I can't stress this enough. They wound on 2+, they cause mortal wounds on 6s to wound, and every wound that goes through their invulnerable save is going to kill a Terminator. That is very good. And yes, you probably won't kill the whole squad with a battery of D cannons, but you can at least ensure that you can kill a couple of models with it, especially with the right buffs, things like Resonator Shard, and if you are playing Uthway, you have the Black Guardian Stratagem, and this can absolutely rip apart Terminator units and essentially kill at least 2 models in that unit. Also, I know Wraithguard aren't very popular, especially the D-Scythe version, because they have, well, basically a lot of issues. They're short range, they can't shoot in close combat, etc. But the D-Scythes are actually good weapons at dealing with Terminators as well, especially Nurgle Terminators, because they still wound on 2+, they're blast weapons and they have a lot of attacks, and they do mortal wounds. So quick shout out to the D-Scythe for this very good incidental weapon matchup. So now that we've covered what is good against each type of commonly found Nurgle enemy, how do you play against Nurgle in general? What are some tips to actually fighting them as an army as a whole? So I think there's 4 main points with fighting Nurgle, and that is, do not engage them in long attrition fights. And I know it's tempting to throw your Ghost Axes into Plague Marines, but they do not trade well against Plague Marines. They're more than double the cost, and not only are they going to be at -1 toughness, but they're also going to be getting wounds rerolled against them because of the Plague Weapon ability, and just in general, they're not going to be very effective against dealing with Plague Marines. They're only going to do 1 damage per attack, and they're just going to sit there essentially for the entire match, not doing much. And because they're not objective secured, Plague Marines will still be capturing that objective, even if they only have 1 model left in the unit. Also, don't try to match them in objective holding ability. Your units are not going to be as good at holding objectives as their units are. If they do wind up on an objective, don't try to contest it with your models. Instead, try to focus on killing that unit. Maybe they score once on it, but try to really focus on killing those Nurgle units around that objective so that you can then take it from them full force. Don't try to muscle it away from them using more models and things like this. Nurgle will pretty much win any mosh pit fight that you engage them in. So if you try to engage them with a lot of different units, and you're not coordinated in your attacks, they will eventually grind you out and essentially win in a couple of rounds of combat, and they will still be scoring on those objectives all the while. So instead, use your speed to be where they are not, and maneuver around enemy units to get to objectives rather than try to fight them on objectives that they already have. The thing about Nurgle is once they set up in an area and they're entrenched, they're not going to move from that area unless you really have a lot of firepower and a lot of coordination going into that attack. So essentially, it's going to take almost your whole army to move them from that position. Now, that is a good plan to do if you do need to move them off of a certain area of the board, is to keep your forces together. But attacking an entrenched Nurgle position around an objective with a couple of units is not the right way to do it. You really have to have a fully coordinated strike with multiple units all fighting and killing the Nurgle units around that objective at the same time. Because what you also don't want to do is allow them to just reinforce that position turns later. So instead, use your speed to again, be where they're not entrenched and maneuver around them. 2 other objectives on the board. And just in general, you want to make sure that your units are being used in coordinated strikes and that your units are not spread out too thin. Make sure that all of your units can support each other, so if you do need to root Nurgle units off of objectives, that you're able to do so in a coordinated way and not just, oh, I have this unit of Howling Banshees in position to assault, I'm just going to throw them in. No, that's not going to work out well for you. So in conclusion, I think the toughness and resilience of Nurgle can make them extremely hard to move from objectives once they are there, and they can score a lot of victory points if you have no answer to them. However, we have speed. If they're on one side of the board, we can be on the other side of the board. We don't have to fight them at their game, right? Unless, again, we have set up a coordinated strike to actually kill several Plague Marine units or things like that. Otherwise, trickling your forces in and trying to take objectives from them that way is just not going to work. And that's why Nurgle is so effective against a lot of these, well, honestly, types of armies, because if you trickle your forces in little by little, Nurgle's never going to lose that kind of fight. You either have to go all in on them all at once, or don't touch them at all and go for other parts of the board. Thankfully, as well, our weapons have a few ways to get around their extremely high toughness, armor, and damage negation. We have a lot of weapons that can efficiently kill them point for point, and they may not be the weapons that we would normally take against things like Primaris Marines and other mech-type enemies, but we do have effective tools against Nurgle. Especially with the right buffs and coordination, a well-conditioned Eldar army can pretty much kill at least 3 units of Plague Marines in a single turn. And I say that because if you are using a 2,000 point army, I don't care how tough the enemy units are, you are going to at least be able to kill 3 units of Plague Marines. Plague Marines are tough by normal standards, but they're not so tough that they can stand up to that much firepower. They just can't do it. And especially since Eldar has a lot of high damage weapons and buffs and debuffs and things like that, there's just no way that in a Strike Force game, 3 Plague Marine units on an objective can survive if you strike them in a coordinated assault. There's just no way they can do it. And to be honest with you, that's fine. They probably have a lot more on the board that's able to score and stuff like that. But, you know, typically what I've found to be successful is either attempting to use your speed against the Nurgle player if they do decide to camp one side of the board, is to capture the rest of the board, surround them with your speed, and prevent them from moving out of their position. That's the first way. The second way is if they do try to spread out more and play more objectives across the board, hit them on one side of the board very hard, eliminate all their units on one side, and then concentrate on the rest of their forces afterward. This way you don't have to deal with the greatest strengths of armies like Death Guard and Nurgle, and you can kind of play your own game and play to your strengths instead of playing to the enemy's strengths. And again, you never want to play to the enemy's strengths. You want to know what your enemy is good at, and you don't want to play that game with them. That's the One way to lose very quickly is if you're playing to the enemy's strengths and you're not playing to your own strengths. Trust me, I was doing this when I first started playing Eldar. I was playing them like Imperial Guard. I was not playing to the strengths of the faction, and I lost every single game. It took me a while to realize that Eldar are not about sitting there and shooting. They're not about sitting there and holding ground. What they're about is using their mobility and high damage to isolate, pick off targets, and control the board. That's what Eldar are good at. And Nurgle typically going to be able to match your speed or the amount of medium range firepower that you can bring to the table. They're just not going to be able to do that. So, in essence, play to your strengths, don't play to the enemy's strengths, and, one of the reasons why I think Eldar is so cool is because we have the ability to adapt to a lot of different situations because of our high mobility and very specialized and high damage units. Alrighty, everybody, that's going to be it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed this video on Nurgle and how to deal with Nurgle units as Craftworld Eldar. Thanks for watching, and I'm planning on doing 3 more videos on this kind of topic about Khorne, Tzeentch, and Slaanesh as well. So stay tuned for those later next week. Alright, everybody, peace out. Have a good one, everybody. See you later.